Progressive rock. Progressive rock, shortened as prog, also known as classical rock or symphonic rock, sometimes conflated with art rock, is a broad genre of rock music that developed in the United Kingdom and United States throughout the mid to late 1960s, peaking in the early 1970s. Initially termed progressive pop, additional elements contributed to its progressive label. Lyrics were more poetic, technology was harnessed for new sounds, music approached the condition of art, and the studio, rather than the stage, became the focus of musical activity, which often involved creating music for listening rather than dancing. Prog is based on fusions of styles, approaches, and genres, involving a continuous move between formalism and eclecticism. Due to its historical reception, prog's scope is sometimes limited to a stereotype of long solos, long albums, fantasy lyrics, grandiose stage sets and costumes, and an obsessive dedication to technical skill. While the genre is often cited for its merging of high culture and low culture, few artists incorporated literal classical themes in their work to any great degree, and only a handful of groups purposely emulated or referenced classical music. The genre coincided with the mid-1960s economic boom that allowed record labels to allocate more creative control to their artists, as well as the new journalistic division between pop and rock. Prog saw a high level of popularity in the early to mid-1970s, but faded soon after. Conventional wisdom holds that the rise of punk rock caused this, but several more factors contributed to the decline. Music critics, who often labeled the concepts as pretentious and the sounds as pompous and overblown, tended to be hostile towards the genre or to completely ignore it. After the late 1970s, progressive rock fragmented in numerous forms. Some bands achieved commercial success well into the 1980s, albeit with changed lineups and more compact song structures, or crossed into symphonic pop, arena rock, or new wave. Early groups who exhibited progressive features are retroactively described as proto-prog. The Canterbury scene, originating in the late 1960s, denotes a subset of prog bands who emphasized the use of wind instruments, complex chord changes, and long improvisations. Rock, in opposition, from the late 1970s, was more avant-garde, and when combined with the Canterbury style, created avant-prog. In the 1980s, a new subgenre, neo-progressive rock, enjoyed some commercial success, although it was also accused of being derivative and lacking in innovation. Post-progressive draws upon newer developments in popular music and the avant-garde since the mid-1970s. Definition and characteristics. Scope and related terms. The term progressive rock is synonymous with art rock, classical rock, not to be confused with classic rock and symphonic rock. Historically, art rock has been used to describe at least two related, but distinct, types of rock music. The first is progressive rock as it is generally understood, while the second usage refers to groups who rejected psychedelia and the hippie counterculture in favor of a modernist, avant-garde approach. Similarities between the two terms are that they both describe a mostly British attempt to elevate rock music to new levels of artistic credibility. However, art rock is more likely to have experimental or avant-garde influences. Prog was devised in the 1990s as a shorthand term, but later became a transferable adjective, also suggesting a wider palette than that drawn on by the most popular 1970s bands. Progressive rock is varied and is based on fusions of styles, approaches, and genres, tapping into broader cultural resonances that connect to avant-garde art, classical music, and folk music, performance, and the moving image. Although a unidirectional English progressive style emerged in the late 1960s, by 1967, progressive rock had come to constitute a diversity of loosely associated style codes. When the progressive label arrived, the music was dubbed progressive pop before it was called progressive rock, with the term progressive referring to the wide range of attempts to break with standard pop music formula. A number of additional factors contributed to the acquired progressive label, lyrics were more poetic, technology was harnessed for new sounds, music approached the condition of art, some harmonic language was imported from jazz and 19th century classical music. Critics of the genre often limit its scope to a stereotype of long solos, overlong albums, fantasy lyrics, grandiose stage sets and costumes, and an obsessive dedication to technical skill. While progressive rock is often cited for its merging of high culture and low culture, few artists incorporated literal classical themes in their work to any great degree, and only a handful of groups purposely emulated or referenced classical music. Writer Emily Robinson says that the narrowed definition of progressive rock was a measure against the term's loose application in the late 1960s, when it was applied to everyone from Bob Dylan to the Rolling Stones. Debate over the genre's criterion continued to the 2010s, particularly on internet forums dedicated to prog. According to musicologists Paul Hegarty and Martin Halliwell, Bill Martin and Edward Macken authored major books about prog rock while effectively accepting the characterization of progressive rock offered by its critics. Academic John S. Kottner contests Macken's view that progressive rock cannot exist without the continuous and overt assimilation of classical music into rock. Author Kevin Home Hudson agrees that progressive rock is a style far more diverse than what is heard from its mainstream groups and what is implied by unsympathetic critics. Relation to art and social theories. In early references to the music, progressive was partly related to progressive politics, but those connotations were lost during the 1970s. On progressive music, Home Hudson writes that it moves continuously between explicit and implicit references to genres and strategies derived not only from European art music, but other cultural domains such as East Indian, Celtic, folk, and African, and hence involves a continuous aesthetic movement between formalism and eclecticism. Kottner also says that progressive rock incorporates both formal and eclectic elements. It consists of a combination of factors, some of them intramusical within, others extramusical or social without. One way of conceptualizing rock and roll in relation to progressive music is that progressive music pushed the genre into greater complexity, while sociologist Paul Willies believes we must never be in doubt that progressive music followed rock and roll, and that it could not have been any other way. We can see rock and roll as a deconstruction and progressive music as a reconstruction. Author Will Romano states that rock itself can be interpreted as a progressive idea. History 1966–1970. Origins. Background and roots. In 1966, the level of social and artistic correspondence among British and American rock musicians dramatically accelerated for bands like the Beatles, the Beach Boys, and the Byrds, who fused elements of cultivated music with the vernacular traditions of rock. Progressive rock was predicated on the progressive pop groups from the 1960s who combined rock and roll with various other music styles, such as Indian ragas, Oriental melodies, and Gregorian chants, like the Beatles and the Yardbirds. The Beatles' Paul McCartney said in 1967, "We the band got a bit bored with 12 bars all the time, so we tried to get into something else. Then came Dylan, The Who, and the Beach Boys. We're all trying to do vaguely the same kind of thing." Rock music started to take itself seriously, paralleling earlier attempts in jazz as swing gave way to bop, a move which did not succeed with audiences. In this period, the popular song began signaling a new possible means of expression that went beyond the 3-minute love song, leading to an intersection between the underground and the establishment for listening publics. Hegarty and Halliwell identify the Beatles, the Beach Boys, the Doors, the Pretty Things, the Zombies, the Byrds, the Grateful Dead, and Pink Floyd not merely as precursors of prog, but as essential developments of progressiveness in its early days. According to musicologist Walter Everett, the Beatles' experimental timbres, rhythms, tonal structures, and poetic texts on their albums Rubber Soul 1965 and Revolver 1966 encouraged a legion of young bands that were to create progressive rock in the early 1970s. Dylan's Poetry, the Mothers of Invention's album Freak Out, 1966, and the Beatles' Sgt Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band 1967 were all important in progressive rock's development. The productions of Phil Spector were key influences as they introduced the possibility of using the recording studio to create music that otherwise could never be achieved. The same is said for the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds 1966, which Brian Wilson intended as an answer to Rubber Soul, and which in turn influenced the Beatles when they made Sgt Pepper. Dylan introduced a literary element to rock through his fascination with the Surrealists and the French Symbolists, and his immersion in the New York City art scene of the early 1960s. The trend of bands with names drawn from literature, such as The Doors, Steppenwolf, and the Ides of March, were a further sign of rock music aligning itself with high culture. Dylan also led the way in blending rock with folk music styles. This was followed by folk rock groups such as the Byrds, who based their initial sound on that of the Beatles. In turn, the Byrds' vocal harmonies inspired those of Yes and British folk rock bands like Fairport Convention, who emphasized instrumental virtuosity. Some of these artists, such as the Incredible String Band and Shirley and Dolly Collins, would prove influential through their use of instruments borrowed from world music and early music. Pet Sounds and Sgt Pepper. Pet Sounds and Sgt Pepper, with their lyrical unity, extended structure, complexity, eclecticism, experimentalism, and influences derived from classical music forms, are largely viewed as beginnings in the progressive rock genre and as turning points wherein rock. Between Pet Sounds and Sgt Pepper, the Beach Boys released the single Good Vibrations 1966, dubbed a pocket symphony by Derek Taylor, the band's publicist. The song contained an eclectic array of exotic instruments and several disjunctive key and modal shifts. Scott Interant of Pop Matters wrote that its influence on progressive rock and the psychedelic movement can't be overstated. Martin likened the song to the Beatles' A Day in the Life from Sgt Pepper, in that they showcase the same reasons why much progressive rock is difficult to dance to. Although Sgt Pepper was preceded by several albums that had begun to bridge the line between disposable pop and serious rock, it successfully gave an established commercial voice to an alternative youth culture and marked the point at which the LP record emerged as a creative format whose importance was equal to or greater than that of the single. Phil Bruford, a veteran of several progressive rock bands, said that Sgt Pepper transformed both musicians' ideas of what was possible and audiences' ideas of what was acceptable in music. He believed that without the Beatles or someone else who had done what the Beatles did, it is fair to assume that there would have been no progressive rock. In the aftermath of Sgt Pepper, magazines such as Melody Maker drew a sharp line between pop and rock, thus eliminating the roll from rock and roll, which now refers to the 1950s style. The only artists who remained rock, proto-prog and psychedelia. According to AllMusic, prog rock began to emerge out of the British psychedelic scene in 1967, specifically a strain of classical/symphonic rock led by the Nice, Procol Harum, and the Moody Blues Days of Future Past. The availability of newly affordable recording equipment coincided with the rise of a London underground scene at which the psychedelic drug, LSD, was commonly used. Pink Floyd and Soft Machine functioned as house bands at all-night events at locations such as Middle-earth and the UFO Club, where they experimented with sound textures and long-form songs. Many psychedelic, folk rock, and early progressive bands were aided by exposure from BBC Radio 1 DJ John Peel. Jimi Hendrix, who rose to prominence in the London scene and recorded with a band of English musicians, initiated the trend towards guitar virtuosity and eccentricity in rock music. The Scottish band 1-2-3, later renamed Clouds, were formed in 1966 and began performing at London clubs a year later. According to Mojo's George Nemeyer, Some claim that they had a vital influence on prog rockers such as Yes, The Nice, and Family. Symphonic rock artists in the late 1960s had some chart success, including the singles Nights in White Satin, The Moody Blues 1967, and A Whiter Shade of Pale Procol Harum 1967. The Moody Blues established the popularity of symphonic rock when they recorded Days of Future Past together with the London Festival Orchestra, and Procol Harum began to use a greater variety of acoustic instruments, particularly on their 1969 album A Salty Dog. Classical influences sometimes took the form of pieces adapted from or inspired by classical works, such as Jeff Beck's Bolero and parts of the Nice's Ars Longa Vita Brevis. The latter, along with such nice tracks as Rondo and America, reflect a greater interest in music that is entirely instrumental. Sgt Pepper's and Days both represent a growing tendency towards song cycles and suites made up of multiple movements. Focus incorporated and articulated jazz-style chords and irregular offbeat drumming into their later rock-based riffs, and several bands that included jazz-style horn sections appeared, including Blood, Sweat and Tears and Chicago. Of these, Martin highlights Chicago in particular for their experimentation with suites and extended compositions, such as the Ballet for a Girl in Buchanan on Chicago Roman II. Jazz influences appeared in the music of British bands such as Traffic, Colosseum, and If, together with Canterbury scene bands such as Soft Machine and Caravan. Canterbury scene bands emphasized the use of wind instruments, complex chord changes, and long improvisations. Martin writes that in 1968 full-blown progressive rock was not yet in existence, but three bands released albums who would later come to the forefront of the music: Jethro Tull, Caravan, and Soft Machine. The term progressive rock, which appeared in the liner notes of Caravan's 1968 self-titled debut LP, came to be applied to bands that used classical music techniques to expand the styles and concepts available to rock music. The Nice, Moody Blues, Procol Harum, and Pink Floyd all contained elements of what is now called progressive rock, but none represented as complete an example of the genre as several bands that formed soon after. Almost all of the genre's major bands, including Jethro Tull, King Crimson, Yes, most of these were folk rock albums that gave little indication of what the band's mature sound would become, but King Crimson's In the Court of the Crimson King 1969 was a fully formed example of the genre. Critics assumed the album to be the logical extension and development of late 1960s work exemplified by the Moody Blues, Procol Harum, Pink Floyd, and the Beatles. According to Mackin, the album may be the most influential to progressive rock for crystallizing the music of earlier bands into a distinctive, immediately recognizable style. 1970s-1980s. Peak years 1971-1976. Most of the genre's major bands released their most critically acclaimed albums during the years 1971-1976. The genre experienced a high degree of commercial success during the early 1970s. Jethro Tull, Elf, Rush, Yes, and Pink Floyd combined for 4 albums that reached #1 in the U.S. charts, and 16 of their albums reached the top 10. Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells 1973, an excerpt of which was used as the theme for the film The Exorcist, sold 16 million copies. Progressive rock came to be appreciated overseas, but it mostly remained a European, and especially British, phenomenon. Few American bands engaged in it, and the purest representatives of the genre, such as Starcastle and Happy the Man, remained limited to their own geographic regions. This is at least in part due to music industry differences between the U.S. and Great Britain. Cultural factors were also involved, as U.S. musicians tended to come from a blues background, while Europeans tended to have a foundation in classical music. North American progressive rock bands and artists often represented hybrid styles, such as the complex arrangements of Rush, the hard rock of Captain Beyond, the southern rock-tinged prog of Kansas, the jazz fusion of Frank Zappa and Return to Forever, and the eclectic fusion of the all-instrumental Dixie Dregs. British progressive rock acts had their greatest U.S. success in the same geographic areas in which British heavy metal bands experienced their greatest popularity. The overlap in audiences led to the success of arena rock bands such as Boston, Kansas, and Styx, who combined elements of the two styles. Progressive rock achieved popularity in continental Europe more quickly. Italy remained generally uninterested in rock music until the strong Italian progressive rock scene developed in the early 1970s. Progressive rock emerged in Yugoslavia in the late 1960s, dominating the Yugoslav rock scene until the late 1970s. Few of the European groups were successful outside of their own countries, with the exceptions of Dutch bands like Focus and Golden Earring, who wrote English-language lyrics, and the Italians La Orme and PFM, whose English lyrics were written by Peter Hamel and Peter Sinfield, respectively. Some European bands played in a style derivative of English bands. The Kosmische music scene in Germany came to be labeled as krautrock internationally and is frequently cited as part of the progressive rock genre or an entirely distinct phenomenon. Krautrock bands such as Can, which included two members who had studied under Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, tended to be more strongly influenced by 20th century classical music. Many of these groups were very influential even among bands that had little enthusiasm for the symphonic variety of progressive rock. Progressive soul. Concurrently, African American popular musicians drew from progressive rock's conceptual album-oriented approach. This led to a progressive soul movement in the 1970s that inspired a newfound sophisticated musicality and ambitious lyricism in black pop. Among these musicians were Sly Stone, Stevie Wonder, Marvin Gaye, Curtis Mayfield, and George Clinton. In discussing the development, Martin cites 1970s albums by Wonder Talking Book, Inner Visions, Songs in the Key of Life, or All Day Music, The World is a Ghetto, or Live, and the Isley Brothers' 3+3, while noting that The Who's progressive rock influenced Who Are You 1978 also drew from the soul variant. Dominic Maxwell of The Times calls Wonder's mid-1970s albums prog soul of the highest order, pushing the form yet always heartfelt, ambitious, and listenable. Decline and fragmentation. Political and social trends of the late 1970s shifted away from the early 1970s hippie attitudes that had led to the genre's development and popularity. The rise in punk cynicism made the utopian ideals expressed in progressive rock lyrics unfashionable. Virtuosity was rejected, as the expense of purchasing quality instruments and the time investment of learning to play them were seen as barriers to rock's energy and immediacy. There were also changes in the music industry, as record companies disappeared and merged into large media conglomerates. Promoting and developing experimental music was not part of the marketing strategy for these large corporations, who focused their attention on identifying and targeting profitable market niches. Four of progressive rock's most successful bands, King Crimson, Yes, ELP, and Genesis, went on hiatus or experienced major personnel changes during the mid-1970s. Mackin notes the September 1974 breakup of King Crimson as particularly significant, calling it the point when all English bands in the genre should have ceased to exist. More of the major bands, including Van der Graaf Generator, Gentle Giant, and UK, dissolved between 1978 and 1980. Many bands had by the mid-1970s reached the limit of how far they could experiment in a rock context, and fans had wearied of the extended, epic compositions. The sounds of the Hammond, Minimoog, and Mellotron had been thoroughly explored, and their use became cliched. Those bands who continued to record often simplified their sound, and the genre fragmented from the late 1970s onwards. In Robert Fripp's opinion, once progressive rock ceased to cover new ground, becoming a set of conventions to be repeated and imitated, the genre's premise had ceased to be progressive. The era of record labels investing in their artists, giving them freedom to experiment and limited control over their content and marketing, ended with the late 1970s. Corporate artists and repertoire staff exerted an increasing amount of control over the creative process that had previously belonged to the artists, and established acts were pressured to create music with simpler harmony and song structures and fewer changes in meter. A number of symphonic pop bands, such as Supertramp, Tank, the Alan Parsons Project, and the Electric Light Orchestra, brought the orchestral style arrangements into a context that emphasized pop singles while allowing for occasional instances of exploration. Jethro Tull, Gentle Giant, and Pink Floyd opted for a harder sound in the style of arena rock. Few new progressive rock bands formed during this era, and those who did found that record labels were not interested in signing them. The short-lived supergroup UK was a notable exception since its members had established reputations. They produced two albums that were stylistically similar to previous artists and did little to advance the genre. Part of the genre's legacy in this period was its influence on other styles, as several European guitarists brought a progressive rock approach to heavy metal and laid the groundwork for progressive metal. Michael Schenker of UFO and Uli Jon Roth, who replaced Schenker in Scorpions, expanded the modal vocabulary available to guitarists. Roth studied classical music with the intent of using the guitar in the way that classical composers used the violin. Finally, the Dutch-born and classically trained Alex and Eddie Van Halen formed Van Halen, featuring groundbreaking whammy bar, tapping and cross-picking guitar performances that influenced shred music in the 1980s. Commercialization. Some established artists moved towards music that was simpler and more commercially viable. Arena rock bands like Journey, Kansas Styx, GTR, Yellow, and Foreigner either had begun as progressive rock bands or included members with strong ties to the genre. These groups retained some of the song complexity and orchestral style arrangements, but they moved away from lyrical mysticism in favor of more conventional themes such as relationships. Genesis transformed into a successful pop act, and a reformed Yes released the relatively mainstream 90,125 1983, which yielded their only U.S. #1 single, Owner of a Lonely Heart. These radio-friendly groups have been called prog light. One band who remained successful into the 1980s while maintaining a progressive approach was Pink Floyd, who released The Wall late in 1979. The album, which brought punk anger into progressive rock, was a huge success and was later filmed as Pink Floyd The Wall. Post-punk and post-progressive. Punk and prog were not necessarily as opposed as is commonly believed. Both genres reject commercialism, and punk bands did see a need for musical advancement. Author Doyle Green noted that post-punk emerged as a kind of progressive punk. Post-punk artists rejected the high cultural references of 1960s rock artists like the Beatles and Bob Dylan, as well as paradigms that defined rock as progressive art or studio perfectionism. In contrast to punk rock, it balances punk's energy and skepticism with art school consciousness, dadaist experimentalism, and atmospheric, ambient soundscapes. World music, especially African and Asian traditions, was also a major influence. Progressive rock's impact was felt in the work of some post-punk artists, although they tended not to emulate classical rock or Canterbury groups, but rather Roxy Music, King Crimson, and krautrock bands, particularly Can. Punishment of Luxury's music borrowed from both progressive and punk rock, whilst Alternative TV, who were fronted by the founder of the influential punk fanzine Sniffin' Glue Mark Perry, toured and released a split live album with Gong offshoot Here and Now. The term post-progressive identifies progressive rock that returns to its original principles while dissociating from 1970s prog styles and may be located after 1978. Martin credits Roxy Music's Brian Eno as the subgenre's most important catalyst, explaining that his 1973-77 output merged aspects of progressive rock with a prescient notion of new wave and punk. New wave, which surfaced around 1978-79 with some of the same attitudes and aesthetic as punk, was characterized by Martin as progressive multiplied by punk. Bands in the genre tended to be less hostile towards progressive rock than the punks, and there were crossovers such as Fripp and Eno's involvement with Talking Heads, and Yes' replacement of Rick Wakeman and John Anderson with the pop duo The Buggles. When King Crimson reformed in 1981, they released an album, Discipline, which Mackin says inaugurated the new post-progressive style. The new King Crimson lineup featured guitarist and vocalist Adrian Belew, who also collaborated with Talking Heads, playing live with the band and featuring on their 1980 album Remain in Light. According to Martin, Talking Heads also created a kind of new wave music that was the perfect synthesis of punk urgency and attitude and progressive rock sophistication and creativity. A good deal of the more interesting rock since that time is clearly post-Talking Heads music, but this means that it is post-progressive rock as well. Neo-progressive rock. A second wave of progressive rock bands appeared in the early 1980s and have since been categorized as a separate neo-progressive rock subgenre. These largely keyboard-based bands played extended compositions with complex musical and lyrical structures. Several of these bands were signed by major record labels, including Marillion, Pendragon, and Palace. Most of the genre's major acts released debut albums between 1983 and 1985 and shared the same manager, Keith Goodwin, a publicist who had been instrumental in promoting progressive rock during the 1970s. The previous decade's bands had the advantage of appearing during a prominent countercultural movement that provided them with a large potential audience, but the neo-progressive bands were limited to a relatively niche demographic and found it difficult to attract a following. Only Marillion and Saga experienced international success. Neo-progressive bands tended to use Peter Gabriel-era Genesis as their principal model. They were also influenced by funk, hard rock, and punk rock. The genre's most successful band, Marillion, suffered particularly from accusations of similarity to Genesis, although they used a different vocal style, incorporated more hard rock elements, and were very influenced by bands including Camel and Pink Floyd. Authors Paul Hegarty and Martin Halliwell have pointed out that the neo-progressive bands were not so much plagiarizing progressive rock as they were creating a new style from progressive rock elements, just as the bands of a decade before had created a new style from jazz and classical elements. Author Edward Mackin counters by pointing out that these bands were at least partially motivated by a nostalgic desire to preserve a past style rather than a drive to innovate. 1990s, 2000s. Third wave, third wave, fourth wave, third wave. A third wave of progressive rock bands, who can also be described as a second generation of neo-progressive bands, emerged in the 1990s. The use of the term progressive to describe groups that follow in the style of bands from 10 to 20 years earlier is somewhat controversial, as it has been seen as a contradiction of the spirit of experimentation and progress. These new bands were aided in part by the availability of personal computer-based recording studios, which reduced album production expenses, and the Internet, which made it easier for bands outside of the mainstream to reach widespread audiences. Record stores specializing in progressive rock appeared in large cities. The shred music of the 1980s was a major influence on the progressive rock groups of the 1990s. Some of the newer bands, such as the Flower Kings, Spock's Beard, and Glass Hammer, played a 1970s-style symphonic prog, but with an updated sound. A number of them began to explore the limits of the CD in the way that earlier groups had stretched the limits of the vinyl LP. Progressive metal. Progressive rock and heavy metal have similar timelines. Both emerged from late 1960s psychedelia to achieve great early 1970s success despite a lack of radio airplay and support from critics. then faded in the mid to late 1970s and experienced revivals in the early 1980s. Each genre experienced a fragmentation of styles at this time, and many metal bands, from the new wave of British heavy metal, most notably Iron Maiden, onwards displayed progressive rock influences. Progressive metal reached a point of maturity with Queensryche's 1988 concept album Operation Mindcrime, Voivod's 1989 Nothing Face, which featured abstract lyrics and a King Crimson-like texture, and Dream Theater's 1992 Images and Words. Progressive rock elements appear in other metal subgenres. Black metal is conceptual by definition due to its prominent theme of questioning the values of Christianity. Its guttural vocals are sometimes used by bands who can be classified as progressives, such as Mastodon, Mudvayne, and Opeth. Symphonic metal is an extension of the tendency towards orchestral passages in early progressive rock. Progressive rock has also served as a key inspiration for genres such as post-rock, post-metal, and avant-garde metal, math rock, power metal, and neoclassical metal. New prog. New prog describes the wave of progressive rock bands in the 2000s who revived the genre. According to Entertainment Weekly's Evan Serpic, along with recent success stories like System of a Down and Up, and comers like the Dillinger Escape Plan, Lightning Bolt, Coheed and Cambria, and the Mars Volta, create incredibly complex and inventive music that sounds like a heavier, more aggressive version of 70s behemoths such as Led Zeppelin. 2010s. The Progressive Music Awards were launched in 2012 by the British magazine Prog to honor the genre's established acts and to promote its newer bands. Honorees, however, are not invited to perform at the awards ceremony, as the promoters want an event that doesn't last 3 weeks. Festivals. Many prominent progressive rock bands got their initial exposure at large rock festivals that were held in Britain during the late 1960s and early 1970s. King Crimson made their first major appearance at the 1969 Hyde Park Free Concert, before a crowd estimated to be as large as 650,000 in support of the Rolling Stones. Emerson, Lake and Palmer debuted at the 1970 Isle of Wight Festival, at which Supertramp, Family, and Jethro Tull also appeared. Jethro Tull were also present at the 1969 Newport Jazz Festival, the first year in which that festival invited rock bands to perform. Hawkwind appeared at many British festivals throughout the 1970s, although they sometimes showed up uninvited, set up a stage on the periphery of the event, and played for free. Renewed interest in the genre in the 1990s led to the development of progressive rock festivals. Praguefest, organized by Greg Walker and David Overstreet in 1993, was first held in UCLA Royce Hall and featured Sweden's Anglagard, the UK IQ, Quill and Citadel. Cal Prog was held annually in Whittier, California during the early 2000s. The Northeast Art Rock Festival, or NEARFest, held its first event in 1999 in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and held annual, sold-out concerts until 2012's NEARFest Apocalypse, which featured headliners UK and Renaissance. Other festivals include the annual Prog Day, the longest-running and only outdoor prog festival in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, the annual Rites of Spring Festival Ro-S Fest in Sarasota, Florida, the Rogue Independent Music Festival in Atlanta, Georgia, Baja Prog in Mexicali, Mexico, Prog Power USA in Atlanta, Georgia. Progressive Nation tours were held in 2008 and 2009, with Dream Theater as the headline act. Night of the Prog in St. Goarshausen, Germany is an established European progressive rock festival held every July during 2-3 days for 12 years. Reception. The genre has received both critical acclaim and criticism throughout the years. Progressive rock has been described as parallel to the classical music of Igor Stravinsky and Bela Bartok. This desire to expand the boundaries of rock, combined with some musicians' dismissiveness toward mainstream rock and pop, dismayed critics and led to accusations of elitism. Its intellectual, fantastic and apolitical lyrics and shunning of rock's blues roots were abandonments of the very things that many critics valued in rock music. Progressive rock also represented the maturation of rock as a genre, but there was an opinion among critics that rock was and should remain fundamentally tied to adolescence, so rock and maturity were mutually exclusive. Criticisms over the complexity of their music provoked some bands to create music that was even more complex. Most of the musicians involved were male, as was the case for most rock of the time. Female singers were better represented in progressive folk bands, who displayed a broader range of vocal styles than the progressive rock bands with whom they frequently toured and shared band members. British and European audiences typically followed concert hall behavior protocols associated with classical music performances and were more reserved in their behavior than audiences for other forms of rock. This confused musicians during U.S. tours as they found American audiences less attentive and more prone to outbursts during quiet passages. These aspirations towards high culture reflect progressive rock's origins as a music created largely by upper and middle class, white-collar, college-educated males from southern England. The music never reflected the concerns of or was embraced by working-class listeners, except in the U.S., where listeners appreciated the musician's virtuosity. Progressive rock's exotic, literary topics were considered particularly irrelevant to British youth during the late 1970s, when the nation suffered from a poor economy and frequent strikes and shortages. Even King Crimson leader Robert Fripp dismissed progressive rock lyrics as the philosophical meanderings of some English half-wit who is circumnavigating some inessential point of experience in his life. Bands whose darker lyrics avoided utopianism, such as King Crimson, Pink Floyd, and Van der Graaf Generator, experienced less critical disfavor. "I wasn't a big fan of most of what you'd call progressive rock," remarked Floyd guitarist David Gilmour. "I'm like Groucho Marx. I don't want to belong to any club that would have me for a member. I still like the original term that comes from 1969, progressive rock, but that was with a small p and a small r, small r. Prog rock, on the other hand, has different connotations of grandeur and pomposity," commented Jethro Tull frontman Ian Anderson on the nuance of the genre. "Back then, when we were doing thick as a brick, bands like Yes and Emerson, Lake and Palmer were already gaining a reputation for being a little pompous and showing off with their music. I think that was okay. The reality is that certain members of Yes were quite humorous about it. They could laugh at themselves, as indeed Emerson, Lake and Palmer privately laughed amongst themselves about themselves." He added, "But that's part of what was going on back then. And I think looking back on it that most of it was a pretty good experience for musicians and listeners alike. Some of it was a little bit overblown, but in the case of much of the music, it was absolutely spot on." List of progressive rock bands